Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today for this conversation, this virtual webinar. My name is Philip Reiner, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of the Institute for Security and Technology. We're really excited to be joined by our panelists here for this conversation today. I think this is a set of issues that are of critical importance as we head further out into this path toward ever more networked and ever more connected battle spaces, and the questions that it raises in terms of how do you actually even consider securing such a complex system. We're really excited to have our discussants here with us today. As per usual with IST webinars, we really look forward to everybody contributing your questions through the course of the conversation. So please submit those via social media. We'll get those questions to the panelists here and make this as interactive as possible. We're super excited to have Heather Richman, who's our one of our board members for here at IST, moderating the conversation here today. But just real quick by way of background, something that the Institute spends a lot of time on in terms of some of the projects that we're working on, but then also just in terms of the research that we do, is this notion that complexity is the enemy of security. And so how do you look out into the future and think about these ever more automated systems and more network systems that are going to enhance the ability of those in the battlefield to communicate and to direct fires? How do you make it so that those systems aren't so overly complex and cumbersome that they're easily vulnerable, and that they actually create more opportunities for the adversary to break down our systems going forward? We have really difficult challenges in the 21st century in terms of managing the battle space. Are we actually building the systems that can best function in those spaces, or are they going to be too complex to even maintain and secure? So really looking forward to this conversation here today. Cannot thank the panelists again enough for being here with us. And with that introduction, I'm going to turn things over to Heather, your moderator for the discussion here today. Heather, over to you.
Phil, thank you so much. Heather Richman, I'm actually based here in Palo Alto, California. My day job, I'm a BM&T, innovation at the defense intersection. But as Phil mentioned, most importantly, I'm a board member for IST, which is an amazing organization. So to learn more, I'm kidding, I'll do that at the end. It's great to have some very knowledgeable people here to talk about JADC2 today. I'm really excited. I'm excited for the conversation. And usually the way I moderate is I just ask the questions I want to know the answers to. So make sure you do chime in. I've got some pre-questions that some of you have sent in, but please, as the conversation, twists and turns, please feel free to jump in. I mean, this is a tough one. A number of schools of thought on the way we need to move forward with this. It's important to bring together academics, industry, entrepreneurs, and frankly, those charged with the mission. And we have a lot of those folks represented here today. So I'm excited to get started. We've got three fantastic panelists. I am going to ask them to spend about 60 to 90 seconds introducing themselves, which is far more entertaining than me reading a piece of paper. So first of all, I'd like to go to Jennifer McCardle, product strategist at Improbable and adjunct senior fellow at CNAS.
Thanks, Heather, and thanks to the Institute for Security and Technology for hosting me. It's great to be here. So as Heather said, my name is Jenny McCardle. I'm a product strategist at Improbable, which is a distributed simulation company that builds large-scale virtual worlds for military planning and decision support. I'm also an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for New American Security. And my work focuses on synthetic training, in particular, kind of cyberkinetic integration.
Fantastic. And where are you located right now, just for fun?
I'm in Washington, D.C. I've tried to put my company's backdrop, but I might have to get rid of it because my computer is moving really slow with it. So you'll see my TV room in a second.
That's fine. You've got my office right here. All right, Mark.
All right. Again, thank you, Heather and Phil and IST for hosting. My name again is Mark Sipe. I'm currently the Director of Strategic Development at the Center for Technology and National Security at MITRE. And the center's goal and my goal is to bring more public conversation of technical and emerging technology concerns out from an FFRDC, a federal research center like MITRE. Prior to that, I was a Navy pilot for 25 years. Flew the E-2C Hawkeye command and control aircraft and commanded a squadron aboard USS Enterprise. So I've got a background in command and control from the tactical and operational levels. And then I finished my time in the Navy as the Navy advisor to the Office of Net Assessment at OSD at the Pentagon, I'm currently in Northern Virginia. This is my son's bedroom, but these are my Legos. So let's not prejudge. These are mine. That's it.
Proud, loud and proud. All right, Mike is the Deputy Director, Director of Strategic Engagement at DIU. Mike.
Thanks, Heather. Thanks, Phil, for having me. Look forward to this conversation. So yeah, Deputy Director, Director of Strategic Engagement for the Defense Innovation Unit. I'll get a little bit more into the background later, but broadly charged with lowering barriers of entry to the defense marketplace for a lot of leading edge dual-use commercial technology companies. Before that, I was the Executive Director of the 809 Congressional Advisory Panel for streamlining defense acquisition. So it was almost a natural move over to DIU. Before that, I retired from the Air Force pilot by training and education, but spent the last half of my career in less fun things like programming, cost assessment, program evaluation, and ledge affairs, which is actually a full contact sport sometimes, but an important part of what we do. So looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome, and I always love when we have dueling pilots. That's really one of my favorites. So Jenny and I are just gonna sit back and watch it all burn down.
We can start talking with our hands.
Okay. Perfect. So Mike, I'm gonna come to you first, actually, just kind of from where you sit and how, just a little bit of background on how you guys are thinking about this right now. And then we'll get a little juicy from there.
Right, so thanks for that. Backing up, before we really get into kind of conceptually what we think that is, a little bit more on the Defense Innovation Unit. We were started about 5 years ago by then Secretary of Defense Ash Carter as a way, like I said, to rebuild that connective tissue between government and the tech ecosystem. They really birthed Silicon Valley back in the 50s and 60s with the space race and whatnot. And his initial go-do was find ways to lower barriers of entry and accelerate that commercial technology to the men and women in uniform to solve those problems. Secretary Mattis liked what we were doing, but his charge was look for those transformative projects, those projects that can scale across services, across platforms, that can truly transform the capability and capacity of the department. And we'll come back to that in our JADC2 discussion. And then finally, to strengthen the national security innovation base, which is the evolution of that triangle of academia, industry, and government that birthed Silicon Valley. Now, no reason for everyone out there to memorize those. I've taken the liberty of writing them down right here that we can reference as we go through our time together today. But transitioning that to JADC2. So there's been a lot of energy around JADC2 and things related to that lately. And it's, the warfighting capability to not only sense, but to make sense and act at all levels, phases of conflict across all domains with partners, both across the Department of Defense and the interagency, as well as some of our partners and allies, and to deliver information advantage at the speed of relevance. That speed of relevance is an important piece of that. So JADC2 has been described as DoD's effort to connect all sensors and operators into a single network. And while that's an important piece of it and foundational part of JADC2, it's much bigger than that, than just connecting sensors and operators. It's about creating a resilient, adaptable line of communication. Oftentimes people use the term mesh network across the entire joint force. And what I mean by that is across all the services, and then to make sure that all those can talk to each other at every echelon, from the strategic level, the leadership level, right down to the tactical operational level. And it'd be need to be protected, hard network to allow the flow of relevant information across all those domains, enabling warfighting commanders, like I mentioned, at the strategic level and senior leaders to make those decisions, and then direct actions down to the tactical level faster than our adversaries, inside the information turn radius of our adversaries, to deter their actions and intents as required, and defeat them outright as necessary.
Thank you. You mentioned key partners. Are these internal partners, external partners, both? How are you guys thinking about that?
Yeah, I think it's both the domestic as well as our partners and allies around the world, for sure, that are part of the concept to solve this.
Perfect. Mark, just getting to I know that you wrote an article back in December, and that was part of the impetus for this conversation, actually, as we're looking at, how DoD's right now talking about building out this concept, this network. you mentioned that the designer should be prioritizing a network, standardizing data versus standardizing a network. Could you expand a little bit on that?
Sure. So starting, I'll go small to big, and talk a little bit about kind of building on what Mike said. Starting with data standardization, it's interesting that as a general crawl over at J6, the Chief Information Officer for the Joint Staff, just this past week at an AFCEA conference out on the West Coast, was basically like, yeah, it's a fool's errand to try to get data standardization. Mind you, he's the same gentleman that said, no, we need data standardization like, 6 months ago, or as he was taking on a job in General Mills, he said that all too. And so even among something as what you would think everybody tends to agree on, is just indicative, I think, of the challenges that JADC2 has. And so I will go more to the point about there's a lot of tech solutions being chased, and I'm still less convinced that we've actually identified the core problem you're trying to solve, or at least agreed upon the core problem. I think people are starting to kind of get around it. Some that Mike said that I would love to see happen, but I'm not confident, especially in my prior history. And Mike, I think you would have seen this too, being in the cockpit yourself, is that I would love all echelons and all nodes to be connected at all levels at all times. And I just don't see how that is realistic. I didn't see that in the real world over a permissive environment like Afghanistan or Iraq. And those adversaries didn't have near the capabilities that we might be looking at in the future. And so in my paper, I'm driving towards the idea that the core tenet of trying to connect everybody all the time is people like Vice Admiral Boxall, who's the requirements director for the Joint Staff, has said, and others, Will Roper and Preston Dunlop and those guys. That, again, sounds awesome, but I have yet to see it in the 25 years I was in combat flight operations and in places like Al-Udeid, and I'm not sure we're going to see that. So I would challenge that JADC2 as its core tenet should consider that the environment is going to be incredibly messy, that resiliency, while a noble cause, is going to be very challenging, and that instead the designers of JADC2 and the purveyors of JADC2 should consider, how do I connect discrete elements at discrete moments of time to get the action I want to take? How can I create a network or command and control, not even a network, just an architecture, such that when I at the ops center am cut off from all my tactical forces, which I will be, because I'm back at Hickam Air Force Base in Pearl Harbor and my forces are forward, or I'm in Yokosuka and I'm cut off because I've been bombed or I've been cyber attacked. How can the tactical forces still aggregate amongst themselves, push the fight forward with the intent that I as the commander have given them, without me quite knowing what is going to be going on, because my command and control and my situational awareness is going up and down? I would like to see, and I think the article kind of hints at that, I would like to see a more fulsome conversation about JADC2 in that context, which I think will be the predominant condition on the battlefield, than an all-seeing, all-global, all-access network that some like Admiral Boxall and others seem to want to try to lay in there.
Interesting. And feel free to jump in, otherwise I can keep asking questions. But if there's comment from either Jenny or Mike, feel free to jump in. Jenny.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here. So Mark, I loved your piece. It was a great piece. What I really liked was the focus on resilience. And when I think about resilience, I see two things. So one is, how do you ensure the security of this kind of complex systems of systems? And I mean, I say that caveating that we know that cybersecurity isn't an end goal, it's a moving target. No system will ever be entirely cyber secure. So that's one piece of the puzzle, which is why when I think about resiliency, I really think about the mission assurance piece. So we have to assume that JADC2 is going to be sabotaged, subverted, subject to espionage. So the question is, how do we train and experiment with it so that when that happens, it still can accomplish a mission? So how do we create that environment where we're subjecting it to cyber and information operations and start to think through the effects of that? And I think that's kind of what Mark's piece was really getting at, which I found the most compelling about it. And I would love to see that conversation happening more. And right now, I don't see that happening in a compelling way. So for instance, right now at present, the DoD has hollowed out its capacity to conduct a large-scale joint experimentation. So no agency, no activity, no joint function currently has that clear responsibility. And then when we're talking about like degraded operations, so simulating information or cyber operations, you can't really do that in a live environment. You have to do that within a simulated environment. And right now we're not investing in the kind of synthetic environments that would really allow us to do that with fidelity. So I think, as part of this JADC2 conversation has to be a larger conversation on what other investments do we need to make to ensure that would ensure from a foundational element, the overall resiliency of JADC2 as a concept.
And you mentioned that kind of who would kind of hold the overall authorities to ensure safety and reliability around a system like this. Mike, do you have any thoughts on kind of where this is being targeted inside as far as overall? You're muted.
Thanks. This is my first video call ever. So sorry about that. Just kidding. So right, it is a joint, obviously a joint concept. So they're going to be pieces that are included with all the services and other partners that we talked about. And, there's been a lot of energy, a lot of things that have come out recently. And I think the focus and nature of some of the experimentation is starting to change. And I think one of the big experiments that's going on is a global information dominance experiment. And I think one of the primary thrusts there is to demonstrate to the combatant commands the value of information. Information is going to be a critical part of this, to include the resiliency, the communication, and the cybersecurity. But the value of that data, what we can actually do today if we apply the technologies that exist to analyze that data that's previously been stovepiped, not being able to fuse some of that sensor data to give a complete picture. And I think the ability to layer that data is going to become increasingly important in denied environments. We continue to practice operations in various denied environments. For example, GPS denied environment using the inertial navigation systems, et cetera. Things like that will continue to play a role and be increasingly important in this environment.
That's great. I mean, and I think, we talk about anti-fragility. So as we're building this out, I mean, there's the idea of it being, well, actually, Mark, you made the point, right? So you must move to greater connectivity from the fringes and more into the center. What do you mean by that?
Say that again. You're breaking up a little bit.
Sorry, Mark. Just kind of pulling off that, Mark. In your article, you talked about kind of degraded connectivity and moving that kind of from the fringes more into the center. What does that mean?
I think it's and what I meant by fringes in the center, fringes of the conversation in the center. So it's what I had said earlier about the idea of talking about degraded comms as its core. I mean, to build a little bit off what Jennifer said, and is, one of the tenets, as she noted in my paper, was the lack of joint training. I mean, admittedly, I'm dating myself, so hopefully the Navy has changed, and us and the Air Force in particular are doing much better at this. But again, when back in the day when Mike and I were operators, the only time we would operate with the Air Force was either in country or maybe during one, what we called the Joint Force exercise, as a carrier strike group on the way to go, do our 6-month or 8-month deployment. In the future, you're not going to have the luxury. You could do that if you want, and you're probably going to lose. The idea of doing joint training, and Jennifer, of course, through her work, is spearheading the live and virtual and constructive training. That's a perfect idea if you can get the joint units involved early, get unit level soldiers and sailors, airmen, Marines, all of them involved right away. But again, all the technical solutions aren't going to mean anything if the people that are going to execute these and use these technologies are not practicing them well before you get into a major combat operation against a pure adversary.
Awesome, Mark. Thank you. I actually have a question from our online audience from Facebook. Hi, thanks for organizing a great panel. A great question. My question is that since connections and EMS are vital to JADC2, do you see a possible application of 5G to JADC2? Anyone? I'll throw it out there. I don't know how to answer that.
So I'll start. Again, so in full fairness, I work at a tech company, but again, I've got an IR background and I'm a policy guy. So and and a former operator, so I can see it, as an operator. But as far as the discrete technologies, what I will say, knowing enough about 5G, is that some of the waveforms and the ability to transmit large volumes of data, I mean, it's very attractive. And recently I was asked, like, what's the Navy doing and this, that, and the other. I know the Air Force is like way ahead of, I think, everybody else in implementation, integration of 5G at a warfighting scale versus, say, like a business practice scale, which the Navy's put them in some warehouses in San Diego, which is a noble first, try, but it's nothing of what the Air Force is doing at some of these locations like Pope and Hill. I think it's got an interesting thing, but again, it's a new mechanism to move forward the same problem set, which is command and control. So how EMS is going to affect 5G and all that kind of stuff, I admittedly can't say too much. I mean, again, seems like a good technology to move forward on, but we're still going to face, if we're going to do 5G, I assume our adversaries are also going to find ways to degrade 5G if they can.
Yeah. Mike, is this part of the strategy that you guys are discussing at all? 5G?
Not specifically with 5G. I agree with what Mark had said, but for us, it is again about leveraging the best of commercial technology that's out there. I mean, look, sometimes complex problems don't require complex solutions. Sometimes they can be simple solutions, or sometimes the solution is a technical solution. Sometimes it's a policy solution. So I don't think it's as straightforward as kind of linear like that, but I do think we see it as a rare opportunity in the architectural design to really get at the problem that we're talking about here, and to borrow some of the best-in-class commercial technology and networking that is out there. I mean, look at commercial applications that are available. I can send an encrypted message around the globe right now with near zero latency on a commercial platform. But yet I still, and this might be operator error, but I still am challenged to send an encrypted nipper email remotely from my home laptop. And so leveraging that commercial technology that's made some of those advances, I think, is going to help us get to that solution. And certainly 5G is going to be part of it, acknowledging some of the limitations that the Mark pointed out.
Is that because of a lack of security? I mean, because a lot of those, apps we're talking about, are theoretically encrypted. I mean, what do you think is holding them back? He's frozen. We'll come back. If either of you have a sense of any other there. I've got a couple more questions here, but actually, I'll stick on this for a second. JADC2 is looking to incorporate, several emerging technologies and what can be done to kind of test, evaluate, validate, verify technologies kind of before they're going onto this network. How are you guys working with or thinking about working with outside entities?
Is this for everyone or for Mike?
For everyone.
I mean, I'm happy to go at this. So obviously, and I think you'll all pick up on this quite quickly. I'm a big proponent of the use of simulation for test and evaluation. I think it's great, particularly when we're looking at software-based technologies like artificial intelligence and machine learning. You can run a simulation over and over and over again to assess, that technology solution. You could also, via the use of digital twins, we could theoretically, if they're part of the procurement process early on, you could build a digital twin of what this kind of JADC2 system of systems could look like, and you could integrate digital replicas of whatever that technology is into the twin for test and evaluation as well. So I mean, I think the future really is taking advantage of simulation-based technology for test and evaluation, and I think to the extent that we can rely on digital twins as well, I think that would be incredibly smart considering how complex this system could be.
One of our business models or tenets of how we work is prototyping, rapid prototyping. We look to not work on a requirements-based process, but a simply stated problem statement where we bring the problem to the commercial sector to solve half a page or a paragraph, and then look to award a prototype contract in 60 to 90 days. So we look to do it relatively quickly, but what the prototyping function does is allows us to do real-time trial and error with the DoD partner and the commercial vendor to put those things in use cases and see what works, see what doesn't, and rapidly adjust fire, as it were, when we do need to shift up and change some of those things. And we've been very successful in being able to, through interactions with the DoD partner as well as the commercial vendor, to make real-time changes and continue to advance that prototype and then transition to production for that commercial technology.
And have you been finding the sorts of capabilities and technologies necessary? I mean, it's out there, it's ready to go?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And again, what we did, we also lowered the barriers to entry to the defense marketplace. There's a lot of leading edge technology companies that have evaluated the $750 billion defense marketplace and said, no thanks, because we have a whole separate customer base, and it takes too long. It takes 2 years to get to a no, or it's too expensive, et cetera. And we've been able to lower those barriers. But an example of leveraging that and getting to, I think a big part of the solution is not just the commercial technology, but it's going to be the commercial iteration and the commercial cycles, and being able to embrace that and adopt some of those things. And one thing we did early on is what we call the tanker planning tool. And it was a legacy system that was used to plan air operations. And we found that operators were actually building everything out in a spreadsheet and then importing it into this program of record. We had some folks out, Defense Innovation Board folks out visiting, and they said, oh, there are software solutions to this. And in a very short time, we were able to implement this, a software solution at significant cost savings. But what we were able to do is prototype that methodology that has now become Kessel Run in the Air Force, an 800-person software development entity that embraces the commercial best practices of DevOps, where they start with the end user in mind and they work on those commercial cycles to be able to iterate. And they're pushing out code daily now, instead of on a much longer time frame that was the historical model for DoD. So again, it's embracing those, not just the technology, but the commercial cycles, and improving through prototype that we think is going to be part of the solution for this.
Kessler is an amazing example, and anytime I hear the word spreadsheet and national security in the same sentence, I get very nervous. So I applaud that. And you mentioned technology and policy so far. I think what you've talked about a little bit is process, right? Internal process, merging with external process. And I think it's a very unsexy concept, but it's one that we all need to realize needs to be fixed.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We've leveraged AI to solve some business practices in the department. And while not as glamorous as other applications of AI, there's huge cost savings there and some benefits, again, with that commercial technology and methodology.
Mark?
I think, yeah, I think one challenge too, Heather, and I saw this with an Army sponsor that I worked with early in my time at MITRES, and this is going to be a shameless plug for MITRES, so forgive me for what I'm about to say, but when they were looking at incorporating AI into some of their command and control at the tactical level, the challenge that they consistently ran up against, including ATEC, Army Test and Evaluation Command, was, yeah, but what about all the proprietary? So like to Mike's point, I mean, if you could build a Kessel Run, that's fantastic. And Army probably should, I know they're moving in that direction generally with AI task force and stuff, but, Kessel Run is definitely like, a pretty cool success story. But with that being said, it's, for a lot of these are being provided. And of course, it's that balance, right? Because MITRE being the third party kind of quality control, if you will, sanity check for the government when they get a commercial product and they say, hey, can you guys break this down and tell us what's going on in here? Sometimes there's a good business case for the person that provided it. So MITRE can provide a third party test and evaluation via. We are doing that via some work with the JADC and some others. But how you walk that line between encouraging the best of industry to come to you with solutions and therefore maybe protect some of their proprietary, secret sauce, while at the same time, when these systems get deployed in mission critical environments, and therefore the service in question needs to understand how much they can trust the system because they've run their own T&E and V&V. There's not a great solution. Like I said, I came off that project and the Army was still trying to wrap their heads around it. But it's something that will have to be addressed as these systems become more ubiquitous inside things like JADC2.
Gotcha. So I've got a couple questions. Let's see, the type is really small. I do apologize. I'm not trying to stare at you all weirdly. So from Twitter, Ari Klein, question for all: how do we balance decentralized C2, optimized for comms denied environment, against a globally integrated C2 structure? optimized to manage century held capability authorities like cyber. Any thoughts on that one? Should we come back? Got more.
No, we'll tackle this one only because the person in question may or may not be somebody I know well. And we've talked about this at nauseam. And although, by the way, Mike Aries is a former aviator like you and me. So he likewise has been in some of these situations. Ari, I think the challenge is how do you enable high demand, low density entities like cyber, like space, like super long range fires, like conventional prompt strike environments and those kind of things. I wish I had a good solution for you. I will say that one of the hills that I continue to die on when people ask questions related to this is if my theory about enabling the tactical edge to do great things in aggregate, that also means then the assets in question have to be available at the tactical edge. It's been a little disheartening over the last 20 years in service or prior service to watch, for instance, again, carrier strike groups for all the other problems they have with vulnerabilities. The long range tanking isn't coming off the carrier, right? We have to rely on our brothers and sisters from the Air Force to provide us the legs we need to go do the things we need to do. So therefore, that carrier is no longer an organic fighting force. It requires something else to make that punch worth bringing to the fight. And cyber and space, which obviously are so niche and have such discrete execution modalities, it only exacerbates the problem. I don't have a good answer for you. I think you can get to a place where you might have those available to you at certain discrete time stamps or time scales, but to assume that you're going to have an all-seeing JADC2 that's going to have that available to you at all times, I don't think is realistic. Mike and Jennifer, I defer to you guys.
I mean, I think the kinetic, non-kinetic piece is particularly interesting from a C2 standpoint because, integrating cyber into kinetic operations brings a whole host of challenges that we don't always think about. Like, I know we like to think about cyber, operating beyond, like at the speed of light, but that's not really the case. It can take months or even years to work through the cyber kill chain. And I guess this is why I always kind of push on the experimentation piece, that I really think we need to be experimenting with this more. And we've had some really interesting examples recently come out. So for instance, with Joint Task Force Aries, there's declassified evidence, and Joint Task Force Aries was the US mission to combat ISIS's cyber capabilities and provide cyber support to kinetic forces. And there was a lot of issues that emerged when it came to target validation, operational deconfliction, interagency coordination, and data exploitation. And I don't see us assuming something like JADC2 is going to solve any of these problems. I think we really need to be experimenting and thinking through these things in more depth and taking lessons learned to the point where we could actually, start integrating kinetic and non-kinetic capabilities in a more kind of compelling way. I don't know if that got at your question at all, but
I think it might have. Well, what we've got. See, Herbert Lynn is asking, what can you say about JADC2 and conventional nuclear integration? Anyone?
Don't do it. There, Herb. I told you, don't do it.
It makes me, I won't deny the fact that we've been using an Uber analogy for JADC2. While I think it's really useful to kind of wrap your head around JADC2, the moment you're using an Uber analogy and thinking about integrating in NC3, it becomes very, very jarring. So I would hope we'd be thinking very carefully about that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Jennifer. I think, and it's interesting because, again, in full transparency, there are really strong technical / policy thinkers at MITRE who are kind of saying the same thing, like, oh, when you say JADC2, don't forget about NC3. And maybe I'm just being old school. Maybe I'm not being evolved enough in my thinking about how command and control will work in this brave new world that we're continuing to drive towards. But I think of NC3 as like obviously the most strategic level communication and architecture among, President, Secretary of Defense, Commander, Strategic Command, and so on and so forth. Whereas I think of JADC2, maybe again, showing my bias of my previous life as from an operational warfighting center like an air operations center or maritime operations center down to the tactical. So I can somehow in my head break those two apart. And then programmatically or bureaucratically, I think I would also make an argument to split those up as well, because you risk burying one under the other. Both of them have been well identified, especially under Secretary Mattis. And even prior to that, with now folks like General Hyten, who used to, of course, be commander of Stratcom, NC3 needs its own love and support and everything else, from congressional appropriations to the programming to the talent management and everything. And I think if those start being coupled together, then you risk losing it all. Whereas NC3, I think, needs to retain its own, and I think can retain its own, because sure, some of the architecture is going to overlap a little bit, but I still think enough of it can be separated into strategic decision-making abilities and empowerment, and then the operational side of conventional warfighting.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I agree. I think there might be some overlap, but broadly, I think it's going to be imperative to keep some of those core functionalities separate for sure.
All right, we agree. And in that, keeping nuclear on the brain, I'm kidding. To what degree will the possible technical failure of JADC2 impact the soon-to-be released joint warfighting concept for all domain operations by the Joint Chiefs? How can JADC2 more effectively integrate cyber and kinetic operations? Let's take the first one. Let me pause there. I apologize. Yeah, soon-to-be released joint warfighting concept for all domain operations by the Joint Chiefs. How are we thinking about that?
So I think the data fusion, well, I mean, in theory, it should get easier under the new joint warfighting concept. I mean, that's some of the goals that we've seen come out from senior levels, developing the military-wide data standards across the departments, and that's going to be critical for this, so that we don't have these things developed in the stovepipes of the services that for sure Mark and I've seen over the course of our career, where things are not, there's not a lot of foresight, and then we try to bolt a bunch of things together and we wind up with some sort of Frankenstein thing that we spend more time with the interface than actually putting foresight into it. So I think it's going to get easier under the new concept.
Yeah, warfighting concepts, and especially ones of like the capstone meta level that you're likely to see from General Milley and Secretary Austin and Deputy Secretary Hicks, it's not incompatible, I guess is the best way of saying it. So it's going to offer, if it's ever declassified, I mean, I'm almost 100% positive JWC is classified going into this round anyway, for probably good reasons. But having seen and having participated in some of the writing and earlier ones, they tend to be pretty high level. They tend to be kind of a snapshot of what either the threat environment or the security environment is, and how, in a very broad manner, the joint force should arrange itself and purchase stuff and exercise and all the things that Jennifer wants to do and should be done. How does it move forward in a very general direction? So I think what you're going to see underneath that and has already been identified, there'll be enabling concepts, of which this is where it gets a little confusing, because the one that the Joint Staff is calling it, they're calling it the Joint Concept for Command and Control, which is not the same as the Joint All-Domain Command and Control team. So how that, I think, is a bigger problem. I think you've got two teams running around doing two different things, but you're going to see a set of enabling concepts, of which command and control will be one of those. And therefore, I think JADC2 will be much more explicitly tied to whatever this joint warfighting concept looks like.
And when are we expecting that?
I think the general has signaled that he's trying to get it done by the end of this month. I saw an article in Defense One recently where General Milley hinted that it's imminent. So I would assume it's within the next 4 weeks or so.
Got it. Mike, any intel? It's coming out. No.
Yeah, I think, yeah, if you kind of read everything that's out in the press right now and kind of all the signaling, it's in the very near term, but I've not heard any specific release dates yet.
Okay. And these two organizations or these two groups are working together, communicating. Do we know, or are we going to get? Okay, just making sure.
Now whether they
all about interoperability and communication. So
now whether they agree or not, Heather, I mean, who can say? As Mike talked about, we can all talk to each other. That means we may not hear each other.
That's fair. That's a fair point. So we got another one here. What does implementing JADC2 mean for force posture There clearly needs to be an increase in autonomous systems, but does it move towards smaller, more flexible autonomous systems and equipped units?
Yes, but it's much more complicated than that. I think obviously that is the direction that things are going. There's a lot of AI there are a lot of AI projects in the department right now, but I think how that actually goes remains yet to be seen. General Shanahan used to give a great brief when he was the director of the JADC. He'd flash up a picture of the movie I, Robot or Ender's Game, which shows a very advanced level of AI and robotics. And he'd always say, this is where we really want the level of development to be for those kind of things. And then he'd flash up a picture of the 80s game Pong. Heather, you remember that. A very simple pixelated video game. And he said, this is actually where we are right now. And so I think it's important to note that that's, certainly there's going to be some of those elements, but that's a ways in the future, yeah.
Yeah, I think a good thing to look at here is DARPA's Mosaic warfare program and how it could complement JADC2. So their idea is to use autonomous systems to basically enable a more kind of disaggregated force design where you make military units and platforms more numerous and recomposable. So a big idea behind the concept is to basically decompose today's kind of monolithic multi-mission platforms into smaller elements that have a smaller amount of functions that could be composable. So for instance, you could take I don't know, a group of strike fighters, and you could take one strike fighter that could become a C2 ISR asset, and you could complement it with, I don't know, standoff missiles and EW equipped UAVs. So the idea behind this type of warfare is that it should increase the adaptability and survivability of US forces by leveraging distributed formations, dynamic composition and recomposition, which is where the whole concept of Mosaic warfare comes from. So I think that's a useful kind of starting place.
Go ahead, Mark.
I was just saying real quick too, Heather, I think with all that though is don't discount the fact that, again, if you believe in the kind of future that I do, where you're going to have pockets running around because the ability to communicate among pockets or back to headquarters can be degraded, you're still going to need humans forward, right? So as folks are talking about autonomous systems, and Mosaic's a perfect example, right? Very powerful if realized. And at the same time, you're still going to need a human forward to make to understand the context of what's evolving right in front of him or her, and then make the appropriate decisions and move these assets forward. So for those who think that it's going to be a clear, at least in the near to midterm, if it's going to be just a robot on robot activity in warfare, I would argue that it could exactly be the opposite, that you actually push, more humans forward because, you're being cut off from a larger, the ability to see a larger picture.
Okay. I mean, Selby was talking about kind of disposable assets, right? Even like this idea of going from like large, massive Navy, assets to things that are more disposable. And again, not without the human interaction, just kind of, first in frontline kind of stuff.
So we just completed a prototype and we transitioned to production on AI-enabled drones that now enable a situation where you don't have to have a squad kick in a door to map and determine what threats are in there. Now they can throw a AI-enabled drone in there that then transmits this information back to that squad outside the structure that will not only map it, but as well identify the threats that it sees using various sensors. So then the next step is to take that and now think about teaming that with a couple of drones in an AI-enabled environment.
Now, you guys have done awesome work on the drone front, and thank you, DIU. So I guess we'll get into, I mean, part of your article, Mark, talks about, and everything we're talking about here has to do with China. We'll say competitors, but how are US competitors seeking to embrace and actively engage in networked warfare? And kind of the next step of that is, if US adversaries are able to utilize successful system attacks that only require minimal technical knowledge, how is adding complexity through JADC2 going to decrease that threat, or will it not?
So I'll take part one, and then I'll defer to Jennifer and Mike if they want to take part two, since it's kind of got a technical vibe to it. But for part one, I think many on this call may already know everything from organizational structures at the PLA, right? So Strategic Support Force, combination of EW, cyber, and space into one organization. Is it perfect? Probably not, but it shows a dedicated effort to align these traditionally, sit in the back enabler domains into like core domain function and the ability to coordinate action. So that's certainly one of it. The kicker, I think, is that kudos to China and to Chinese thinkers for studying 30 plus years of US warfighting history, right? I mean, I think it's growing in the national security community here in the United States that we did great things in the Gulf War and we wrote everything down and we published it all. And guess what? Those are now the things that they study and study pretty regularly to understand how we were so effective in what we did. And what was very fascinating is that they went beyond just kinetic effects and said, how did they enable it? How did the American forces enable this? And they started taking a deeper dive into like how we command and control, and started understanding how nodes interact and what an operational center means, and also their kind of studies. And you have to give them credit for that. So at least on a bureaucratic and a more academic level, they are definitely taking lessons and are aligning themselves to do intelligentized warfare, as many of the Chinese thinkers here in the States talk about.
Yeah, and just quickly to build off Mark, I think it's very important for us to remember that while Chinese or Russian capabilities may not be comparable in the aggregate to US military capabilities, what really matters is a localized correlation of force in key regions. And in certain instances that will or could very likely swing in China or Russia's favor. So we definitely need to be very aware of that and take their military modernization very seriously. I'm happy to try to take the second half, unless Mike, would you like to go first?
No, go ahead.
So, I think this question's interesting. First, because I'm not entirely sure that these kind of attacks require minimal technical knowledge. I think it depends on what you're talking about. So there's two different pieces at play here. The first is that complexity breeds vulnerability. And in the cyber community, this is called the cyber capability vulnerability paradox. So it's the idea that as a system becomes more capable or more complex, you will have more vulnerabilities for cyber exploitation. Now, that does not mean that a very exquisite system that'll take little technical knowledge to target a very exquisite system. As I said earlier, it can take months or even years to work through the cyber kill chain. And that doesn't mean that that system will not be exploited. It just means that technical knowledge is probably required and that you need an adversary that is persistent. But I think, the second piece of this, and I'm guessing this is what the question was coming from, is looking at maybe information operations and how it requires very little technical knowledge to sow the information space with disinformation or misinformation. And this is also something that I do think we need to be training and experimenting for from a C2 standpoint. And we actually already have these environments where you can train for kind of social media operations or information operations. So for instance, like VATC has a digital media replicator, and Nusora has a simulation deck. And right now they're used to basically train intelligence operators, find kind of esoteric pieces of information. But we could be doing so much more than that. And we could be thinking strategically about, how do you inject this information into kind of experimentation or training simulations? And how do you have people troubleshoot that and correlate that information against other feeds of information that they're getting so that they can effectively respond and ideally maintain mission assurance? So yeah, that's my attempt at that question. I'll hand it over to Mike now.
No, I think you're right, and it comes into like you said, the misinformation and the disinformation and the fusing of all of that historically stovepipe info and being able to correlate and make sense of that on a time scale that you can actually that it's usable before the information perishes.
Terrific. Great job, guys. Mike, we're going to stick with you for a second. So you talked earlier about data, massive amounts of data. What is the DoD doing to prepare for the massive amounts of data necessary to enable JADC2 really?
Well, I think, backing up a little bit, I think it's important to acknowledge that the department is starting to recognize this humongous mound of data that they are sitting on and things they need to do. I think we're starting to see things like data architecture as a career field. We're starting to see things like, backing up a little bit. When I was in the Air Force, there was a thing called a single page CERF, which captured your entire career with qualifications, et cetera. And the Air Force tracked people who spoke foreign languages and paid them money because there's a strategic importance to that. And the Air Force has just now started tracking things like people who speak Python, kind of an AI-based coding language. So I think all of that goes to the realization that there's a whole mound of data out there, and what are the best ways to use it, and the common standards to use it. And I think it goes back to what I talked about before, is fusing all of that data and taking this inflection point where we are now, where we do have a lot of stovepipe mission systems, legacy systems, and acknowledge the challenge of those range of sensors and being able to make some sense out of that. We recently completed a project with NORAD and Northcom, where we were working with air defense operators, and they monitor upwards of a half a dozen siloed legacy systems, in some cases that present different pieces of information that was necessary for air surveillance. And so we worked with a commercial vendor, and what we were able to do is merge live feeds from FAA sensors, flight plans, even weather data, to take all of this information and data and be able to make sense of it. And we took an approach of an open cloud-based architecture that's capable of ingesting and fusing and exposing that complex, varied data sources to aid in analysis and decision making.
When you say open cloud-based, from a security standpoint, I know there's been challenges before kind of declassifying data. Have you dealt with this at all?
I'm sorry, say that last part again.
Have you just kind of figuring out, as I've worked with a bunch of folks kind of here in Silicon Valley on the company side, kind of the declassification of data for simulation, as Jenny talked about. I mean, how is that working? Are you working in a completely classified environment, or maybe you talked about kind of an open cloud-based network? So that's new verbiage for me.
Yeah, it's something we're still working through. It's that fine line of classification, but also moving rapidly. So we're still working through some of those nuances, especially as we work with the commercial vendors, because all of that is it's dual use technology that's out in the on the market.
Jenny, what are your thoughts on that one?
Well, I mean, at least from like a simulation and training standpoint, of course, I can't speak to how JADC2 is thinking about this, but I'm sure there's lessons learned. So you can run a simulation where, say, it's at the secret level, but you're injecting in information that's TSSCI, but what you're doing is you're just showing the effect of that information. So you could be showing the effect of a cyber operation without actually putting through information that would be classified at the TSSCI level. So you're able to strip that out and just show the effect. They do that in simulations with intelligence. So a lot of simulations are held at the secret level for military training, for C2 training, and they will put in ISR information, but all of the TSSCI information stripped out, so it's just secret. So a lot of thinking through, what do you actually need to show? Do you actually need to show that information, or can you just show the effect of that information? And oftentimes the effect, depending on what the purpose is for, if it's for training in particular, then you don't actually necessarily need something that's classified. And I know they're thinking about this too when it comes to, like, say, integrating F-35 simulators with simulators that may be at the secret level. So this is definitely something that the simulation community has been grappling with for a while.
And I think in an operational context, if you're at an op center, if you're on a tactical edge in like a again, carrier strike group or something of that nature, the challenge becomes is not just the volume, but are you getting? I mean, what's the right information, or what's the right and at the same time minimum amount of information that a person needs to make a decision. And that's the thing that I don't think anyone at JADC2, I think there's acknowledgement of the problem or acknowledgement of that dynamic, but I don't feel like there's quite yet a purposeful drive to that. And each one's gonna be different, right? I mean, what Admiral Davison needs out at Indo-PACOM is gonna be different than what a carrier strike group 1-star admiral might need. out there on the tactical edge. But nevertheless, when you start thinking about degraded communications and the ability to move minimal amounts of information across long distances, being ruthless about, no kidding, what do you need? Like, do we all really need video teleconference capabilities between the 1-star admiral and the 4-star admiral? Or is it enough just to have some kind of, classified chat that is authenticated or encrypted, of course, but otherwise, Admiral so-and-so, go forth and do great things. Much better than a freaking high bandwidth, long latency video teleconference as one example. And yet for 30 years, that's what we've gotten our senior leaders used to. And how they are ruthlessly cutting down to the minimum data needed to be exchanged between echelons and then among echelons to make the war happen is something that they need to get after, but I'm not convinced they've really tackled that in a coherent fashion yet.
Got it. Thank you. We're getting close. I've got one more, and it says question from Twitch, which I'm not sure if that's a dating app or a person. I don't actually. My social media skills are lacking. We're just going to go for it. How can the U.S. and allies test its increasingly complex systems against other increasingly complex systems? For example, how would the U.S. even model for synthetic or joint forces exercises when you throw in some of the complexities of, say, Chinese AI systems working across physical and cyber domains? How does the U.S. model? How does the U.S. model and build resilience within this environment? Mike, I'm looking at you.
Yeah, and I'm looking at Jennifer because she's the modeling expertise. I guess I'm gonna defer most to Jennifer because I think her expertise. I will simply say, as an operator, it's a hell of a great question. I think there has been, Jennifer, tell me I'm wrong, there's been numerous efforts through all the different services of, hey, look, we've got this thing called StarCraft out there, which has mountains and mountains of factors, and we've got AlphaGo and AlphaZero that have beaten it. Like, why can't we have, DeepMind's AlphaStar, just do the same thing for us military types, and the level of complexity, of course, the cost too. I think it just goes up so exponentially that what you wind up devolving to are more like seminar style war games, which have their own place, but obviously are a little bit more clunky than, say, like a modeling or simulation environment.
Jenny, any comments?
Yeah, so obviously part of the thing with simulation is you're trying to build you're trying to make complexity accessible when you build these kind of large scale synthetic environments where you're operating with a lot of different models, whether, you've got models of, human pattern of life, models of critical infrastructure, models of the information environment, what have you. You're basically trying to break down that complexity to make it understandable to the person that's using that environment, whether that's environments for decision support or for training. I would hope that the US is looking at how China is thinking about its, future kind of systems of system structure, how it's structuring its battle networks, and thinking about ways to build models around that. It could be pretty compelling if you were to build a digital twin of this, and this would obviously be highly complex, but if you were to build a digital twin of how the Chinese are thinking about systems of systems warfare, and you were to do the same with the US, that could make some pretty incredible. You could run those simulations against each other, which could be really, really interesting to develop new kind of concepts of operation, particularly when you're thinking about the role of autonomy and the fact that new kind of concepts could theoretically be developed that might be a little somewhat alien to us, like what Mark was talking about with AI and Go and stuff. So I think all of this is theoretically possible. It's just, it's making sure it would be for having the intelligence to, I guess, build that digital twin and making the investment. Also, modeling some of these things are challenging. We don't really have very good models of the cyber environment right now. We don't have very good models of the information environment. So it's thinking about, like, what is it of that environment that you want to model that would actually be compelling when you're trying to think through these things.
Terrific. Well, I was going to do kind of a flash, how far are we out question. We don't really have time. But if as you guys are thinking about this, how far into the future are we thinking that we're going to have a capability, however it ends up being built? We don't know.
I defer to Mike on this.
Yeah. Go to the DIU.
Right, last word, DIU.
I would say there is a near, mid, and long-term horizon for various stages of this.
Got it. Perfect answer. Perfect. I also did learn that Twitch is a video streaming service, so I'm very excited about that. Thank you guys all so much. I know this is really just kind of the beginning of the conversation. We're going to get deeper into the General Shanahan. Really wanted to be here, and so we'll bring you guys back. I know we'll get a lot more questions. For anybody out there in the world, info@securityandtechnology.org is an email if you've got additional questions or want additional information. Also, securityandtech.org is the website. At the very bottom, you can actually sign up to get the emails. We're going to be having we're going to be having actually an upcoming event around ransomware. So do that, or also there's Twitter, there's LinkedIn, all those things that I'm terrible at. But I thank you guys. Thank you, Jenny, so much for your service, for your carrying on this. Mark, thank you for writing about it, for being vocal about it. And Mike, thank you for operationalizing this and everything you guys are doing for TIU.
Thanks, Heather.
All right, guys.
Thanks, Heather.
Have a great Wednesday. Take care, guys.
Thanks, Heather. Thanks, everybody.